vote. Now I'd like to introduce George Glass, who will be moderating this panel discussion. It's dynamic orchestration, paving the road to the intelligent autonomous networks. George is CTO at TM Forum, where he leads a lot of the industry collaboration around the digital transformation of IT and networks. And before that, he was chief architect for BT. George, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome wherever you are in the world. It's my pleasure to join you today, and I'm joined today by Mark Saunders, who's chief architect at Telstra, Vikrant Bhargava, who's General Manager of Engineering at Airtel, and Chris Wade, who's the CTO at Itential. Now, we've got a very interesting topic today around dynamic orchestration. And I just want to set the scene a little, because what we're actually seeing is that new technology, network function virtualization, software-defined networking, cloud-native networks, 5G and the much talked about 5G slices, which are dynamically configurable during the lifetime of a product or a service, is actually driving the need for automation and particularly dynamic orchestration. But we've been looking at this from a number of angles and looking at the delivery of connectivity, which is no longer static, as I've said. And really what we're looking at then is real-time monitoring and the ability to dynamically change the characteristic of a network. We're going to need real-time dynamic orchestration. So I want to bring in Mark initially from Telstra and welcome you and just say decoupling the service from the technology heightens the need for dynamic service orchestration. How are companies, and in particular Telstra, approaching that challenge today?
Yeah, g'day. Thanks, George. Thanks for having me here. So I think a couple of key words you talked about there, and that is end-to-end automation and across multiple domains. And I think where Telstra have been on a bit of a journey for a while. You heard, I think, in the last session, Kim talk about some of the needs to have discipline in our architecture and to be far more loosely coupled. And that's my role inside of Telstra, and we've begun on that journey, certainly with our network as a service initiatives that have been going for a little while now, and we're recently starting to embark on how we further decouple some of our IT as a service to get a bit more rapid speed to market. But look, I think the essence of this is getting the foundation right. So before we sort of jump into dynamic orchestration, which, to your point, George, is pretty crucial to, I think, the world we all want to operate in, we're going to lay a really strong foundation and that architecture discipline. So for us, it was about being a domain-driven design. And the word domains use an awful lot across the industry. But I think as the telco industry has evolved, we've borrowed that concept from very well driven software practices, and the concept of domain-driven design is very mature in the software industry. I think whereas the telco industry are trying to adopt that. The domain-driven design is about being very clear around how we have bounded context, a clear separation of concerns, and when we define a domain or a bounded context, a very clear way to interact with that through an API and a service contract. And that's to run the full life cycle of things you'd want to do to interact with that domain. I think the next step on the foundation is what we have done with the network as a service, and that is to build a catalogue, a library of what those services are, so they're easily discoverable for the consumers to ultimately build customer services and the value over the top. I think like the next stage is the composition, where we need to ultimately, we don't offer domains to our customers, we offer services, value, and we try and create them. So it's how do we build that logic and that service and that experience that spans multiple network domains and IT domains. But look, to be fair, several of us, I think, in the industry are already doing parts of that already. I think we're all on that journey, and we're all probably maturing all of those key concepts about that loosely coupled, API-driven, domain-driven. I think what makes the a dynamic orchestration a little bit differently is that is the next phase of it. And I think you've got to lay that foundation. We can't sort of wake up one day and go, we want dynamic orchestration and the benefits of being autonomous. I think we've got to sort of lay that very strong discipline and foundation along the way. But look, I think it introduces a few new concepts into the mix when we now talk about dynamic orchestration. It's abstracting the what from the how and acting on intent through it, which I think is what you mentioned there, George, a little bit around decoupling of the service from the technology. So it's being instructed into these domains on the business intent and being declarative of that rather than being prescriptive. So we need to decouple the what from the how. And building an ongoing knowledge in runtime of the service using technologies like AI and ML, analytics, and we then need to feed that back in again to dynamically be changing the policy against that intent to I think get that dynamic outcome. Look, that'll require adoption of quite a few new technologies and probably industry evolution and industry alignment, but I'm sure over the course of the next 20 odd minutes, we'll talk about some of those technologies.
I think so, Mark. And actually, I want to bring Vikrant in here because I've been working with Vikrant on closed loop anomaly detection. And you mentioned the need for AI and machine learning and AI operations to actually manage this dynamic orchestration. Vikrant, I'm sure you have something to say about data in this space as well with your background in Airtel and automation around closed loops.
Yeah, so in fact, George, that's a very pertinent question because we all are talking about orchestration here. And Mark brought about a very relevant point that you can only orchestrate if you've got a right foundation in place. And data becomes one of the very important pillars for this foundation. Now, the reason I'm saying is that, if you see the whole cycle that we have followed at Airtel, it is divided into three pieces. One is the detection. Unless you get the right data points, unless you detect the right problems, how do you remediate? So that is where almost 60% of our focus at Airtel has been on the detection because we feel that if you put right focus on detection, you can get the right orchestration and remediation right. A very important point which I would like to make here is that input to orchestration is decision and input to decision is data. And that is where the data becomes very, very important. Now, while it looks a very simple term, but ultimately, there are a lot of subcomponents as well, which we have covered at Airtel and which everyone needs to cover. So, for example, how do you bring the data from so many sources? And with the advent of IoTs, there are millions and millions of devices. How do you bring the data? Second piece becomes that once you bring the data, how do you process the data? And that is where Mark touched about some of the technologies like AI, MLs, the Sparks, the Ebony-Shows, all of those comes into the play. The third piece is that once you've processed, how do you make use of this information in the real time? So if you see the whole data journey, these are the three sub pieces which are very, very important as an input to your orchestration. What we feel at Airtel is that executing a playbook is very, very simple. I think the decision when to execute and how to execute, Mark also touched upon that point, is something which is very, very important. And that is where data plays a very, very important role. You ask about my experience at Airtel. With these pieces, running our complete AI ops practice, we have been able to bring about almost 88% reduction in the outages using the same framework. And journey, I would say, is a recent. It's just 1.5 years old. I mean, there's a lot of work which to be done. And with these pieces, organizations can certainly achieve a lot in upgrading and enhancing their experience by miles. That's what I say.
Thank you, Vikrant. And I want to bring Chris in here because whenever we actually look at these new services that we're talking about, clearly when I ordered a product previously and it was what I would call a static product, you configured it and you set it up in the network and that's the characteristics it had until you then put another change order in against it. What we're actually talking about here is dynamic orchestration, being able to change the characteristics of the service in real time during the life of the product, even as the product is being used. What's the difference then between this real-time services and traditional fulfillment, Chris, from your perspective, and the role that dynamic orchestration plays in that?
Yeah, so I think when we've talked about the services today, we've talked a lot about, I've heard a lot of AI and ML type of discussion, and it sounds like a level of complexity that's going to be introduced in addition to the rest of kind of the traditional OSS process. I would challenge us to think about making these services much more real time, which I think actually reduces the complexity. When we have to consider, in-flight changes, the longer it takes to fulfill orders, traditionally, the more opportunity we have for modifications in the OSS process, which actually kind of increases the complexity. So I think we can start to use these technologies to really simplify. I think the initial reaction is there's a level of complexity that we're going to insert. But if I could add maybe one other question back to some of the first points, is that we talk a lot about the data collection, and we talk about the dynamic orchestration, especially with service abstractions as kind of an internally consumed concept within service providers. I think one thing that could be hugely differentiating is that we empower our end users to have access to this data. The level of innovation that our customers can provide can be somewhat constrained by the types of resources that we expose. So all of this tremendous data we're talking about that influences our dynamic orchestration concepts, if we can expose that to our end users, they'll innovate on top in ways that we can't necessarily think of. And I would challenge that we don't artificially constrain what is possible within our networks by exposing this dynamic orchestration and all of this data we're talking about in a meaningful way back to end users.
I think that's a great point, Chris, because I've been looking at this in the concept of accelerating new service introduction and enabling new revenue streams. And I would always challenge that it may not be the telco that builds the new revenue streams. It's the telco participating in an ecosystem. And I'm thinking along the lines is if we can dynamically assemble products which we sell to customers from flexible reusable services, i.e. we start to see a software-driven network that's dynamically orchestratable, then we can actually vary in real-time bandwidth, security, latency, throughput characteristics, and that will create the opportunity for generating new revenue streams. But that also brings in new players into the market. So in this world where we're going to see a mix of telcos, other service providers, even the hyperscalers playing alongside it, bringing in their cloud compute, their edge compute, and really trying to get under the skin of what role does dynamic orchestration play and what role do the hyperscalers start to play in this world where I've got so many moving parts. I'll throw that out to the panel and see who wants to pick it up.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that, George. I think they play numerous roles in regard to this. And I think there's sort of a one where we're using them and consuming them, and as a telco, as probably any other enterprise would, and how do we put some of the OSS systems and BS systems on the hyperscaler, and how do we modernize those systems and do that probably with a lot more scale and elastic nature to it. Right? I think there's a second conversation around working with them as a telco industry on actually putting some workloads, network-based workloads on there. And look, there's all different telcos at different points of that journey. And there's a lot of philosophical debates around how you do that and the way forward. But I think that's the other area to explore, I think, as a telco on that. I think the third one is really where we're trying to weave together, I think, computer network and arguably the application actually out to the end customer in some value-based way. So, and I think it particularly comes to life a little bit more when we talk about edge compute, where the network and the compute is actually more intimately woven together. And I think it goes back to a key word I said before, the value that comes from that for the end user. And earlier on, I talked about the importance of domain-driven design and modeling our network in these sort of bounded contexts and domains so that we can ultimately link them together to provide that value. I think what we don't want to do is pass on that complexity to the end customer or the consumer. So it's about then trying to innovate around how do we simplify that to the app developer or to the ISV or to the user of the application that we might put on top of it. And I think that's where what we're talking about here today, dynamic orchestration, really comes to life. So if you start to imagine a world where telcos have offering things up to the customer that they want to be able to move and change how they access that compute, and how they scale that compute and how they scale the network, but also at runtime, how we manage the events that are occurring. So what happens if that application on the edge is scaling out? It's non-infinite resources. Or what happens if there's congestion in the network? Or in a mobility use case, what happens if the UE or the end user is mobile and moving? So the world at runtime is always evolving and changing. And I think handing back that complexity back to the end customer is probably not the right way. And we need to sort of, I think, through technologies that we're talking here today on dynamic orchestration, try and simplify that and solve that problem. I think so that's, I think, a more complex way of the last one of exploring that relationship with the hyperscalers. But in terms of how you need to implement that, I'll make one other comment and hand to the other guys. But I think you need to think about, once again, the domain-driven concept of it. So a hyperscaler, you still need to model up, even though they're an external party. The term we use inside of Telstra is an unmanaged domain or an uncontrolled domain, where much like our internal domains, where we build a very strong API interface and logic and build up data and AI and awareness to create a service offering, we want to conceptualize the hyperscaler very much in the same way, so that we can, both at design time and runtime, weave the network and the application and the network and the computer all together.
So I've got to pick up on that, Mark, because you keep talking about domain-driven design. And certainly when we've been looking at autonomous networks and the patterns required to actually manage autonomous networks at scale, we're subdividing the IT and network services into domains that are interacting with each other and are controlled by dynamic orchestrators. So I may actually be offering a service using one particular type of technology, which if that domain is failing, I then hand control over to another domain to actually continue delivering the service to the customer. And as you said, we're taking complexity away from the customer. But boy, is that complexity landing in the middle of the person that's controlling the orchestrator. The dynamic orchestration is becoming much, much more complex. And you may not, you said you talked about an unmanaged domain or an uncontrolled domain. How do you manage an end-to-end service whenever you don't maybe have control of the domain, or you don't even have control of what's going on within the domain? Chris, can I bring you in to say, look, you know, this orchestration is becoming much, much more complex. You're managing domains where you're not in control of the domain. This is moving away from the concept of a traditional telco who owned a network, built a set of products from the network services and sold them to their own customers and owned everything between the customer and their network, soup to nuts, nobody else was involved. This has just blown it all apart.
For sure. And I mean, at the end of the day, there was a number of schools of thought about centralizing everything, right? So we've had concepts of centralized inventory, understanding all of my assets, and then figuring out how I can construct my assets to provide a service to my end user. You know, we believe we're in the early days of this innovation cycle. More domains are coming. More complexity is coming, and really the only way to handle this is to have a federation first mindset. You know, when we're looking at putting these dynamic services together, I've heard a lot of intent words thrown around today. So we have to understand how we can interact with these domains, but in a loosely coupled way, so that we can plug each of these in. So you know, it's almost like we've gripped it so tight it squeezes between our fingers here. I think we're going the other way in the sense that we have to be super federated. And whether it's third-party assets, whether it's the hyperscalers we're talking about, or whether it happens to be my own assets, you know, at the highest level, we have to have constructs that are less concerned with those, so that we can piece them together.
And Vikrant, can I just bring you in here then in terms of trying to do anomaly detection maybe within a domain where you don't own all of the assets? It's a partner's domain. It could be a hyperscale domain. It could be another network provider. How's Airtel approaching that, and how's that fitting into your closed loop anomaly detection, pattern recognition, so forth?
In fact, George, let me just add a bit of complexity here, and let me just give you a very real life example. So today, if a customer goes to an Airtel store to buy the SIM, there are 16 Airtel systems which come into play: provisioning systems, inventory systems, network fulfillment systems. There are 6 external systems which come into play. I'm not talking about microservices here. I'm talking about the large. So for example, if a customer buys the same, he's entitled to for Amazon Prime, Netflix. So it's not just about the provisioning of a network. It's also about, as we were talking about, the provisioning of a service. And that is where, from an anomaly detection perspective, it is very, very important to aggregate and correlate those domains and correlate the data. And it is important to not just look at an individual applications level, but a key concept which we have introduced at Airtel is something called as a customer journey. So your orchestrations, your automations, your data should not be on the basis of the systems, on the basis of the applications. Those have to be on the basis of the customer journeys. And that is where another coin which we have termed is an identification, anomaly detection of a cause and not a symptom. For example, if something goes wrong in the service path, there could be a lot of other things which got impact. So you could generate a lot of anomalies as a symptom. But point is that as a part of your anomaly detection system, are you able to identify the anomaly from a causing application, or the causing system is the main jigsaw puzzle which we have been trying to solve. Now, once this is identified, of course, then your orchestrations come into the play. But the manual actions, the manual correlations are not possible. That is where basically we are working on a lot of AI-based systems to get this through. The third most important piece, George, which I would like to touch upon is that many a times when I interact with organizations, they ask me, how do we start? And I think that is where a very key concept of trigger to action is important, because most of the organization, whether it's an engineering domain or a network domain or a customer journey domain, almost 40 to 50% of the patterns, you talked about patterns, are actually fixed. And those becomes your low-hanging fruits to actually start, not just on the anomaly detection piece, but also on the orchestration piece. In fact, just to share some of the numbers with you, on our customer journeys, which is, I was talking about the SIM fulfillment process, almost 83% of the situations are self-healed today, using the same framework which I just explained. So first of all, it should not go wrong. But even if it go wrong, then in 83% of the situations, those get auto-corrected. And that is where we are basically meeting our targets of 2.5 minutes for SIM provisioning, etc., etc. So very important, to look at it from a customer journey lens is a very important point.
Excellent, Vikram. And actually, we've got a question has come in from the audience, and I'm going to relate it to what you've been talking about. So you've talked about AI-based systems and AI being important for this. And the question is, how much of 5G automation will actually be AI assisted, and how much will we rely on rules similar to SON? And I presume by saying SON, they mean self-organizing networks. So I'm just looking at that question, and we're talking about this dynamic orchestration because we've now got a dynamic network that can change its characteristics. So does anybody want to throw out their opinion and answer the question from the audience on how much of 5G automation will actually be AI assisted?
I'll jump in there. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, if I think about the question, when I hear SON and I hear 5G, I think it's very radio centric, maybe, in how we're thinking. So obviously within that domain, we've been talking about kind of this concept of most of our services traversing multiple domains. I would challenge us to think even bigger in the sense that 5G, beyond the RAN, most services are going to traverse multiple domains. So it might be across a backhaul that's segment routed. It might be routed out applications and the hyperscalers we've talked about. So when we start talking about the technologies that are going to be used to attack the orchestration and also the assurance in each domain, they'll definitely be assisted. But I would think we need to think about the tightly coupled systems we're talking about before and trying to build that system across all those domains. So I think if we can compartmentalize or push that complexity into the domain, the machine learning type of concepts for the data that's collected within the RAN might be very different from in the backhaul versus how we're working in public cloud.
Go ahead, Vikram.
Yeah, just one small addition I would like to make it to Chris. See, I think a pertinent question, will advent of AI, how should you drive the advent of AI? See, with 5G coming in, your bouquet of services will become even more complex. And if your bouquet of services are becoming more complex, where you are taking your devices as closer to the customer, and customer is generating much more amount of data as he or she is today is, the possibility of taking manual actions and or the possibility of taking semi-automated actions will become even more remote. And that is where basically as an engineer or as a tech guy, it's both from an engineering and network perspective, it is important to understand more and more use cases which are more AI driven on that front. Because if that is not there, you cannot survive. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, very good. And I see, just building on that, at the very outset, Mark was talking about decoupling, the service from the network. And that's a model that I really love to see, even decoupling the product from the service. And we've used the term intent, and we have customer intent-based operations. And you want to build a technology agnostic set of products that you sell to the customer. But then whenever you get down to the service layer, the service has to orchestrate these different domains that are going to deliver the customer experience. And I think that is, what Chris was hinting at, was saying, let's take a step back from 5G and thinking it in terms of automation, but actually think of it in terms of a service and what service the network delivers, where you have things like network as a service, and then I can switch between these domains and deliver the self-healing characteristics of an autonomous domain. And I just would like to get, Mark's perspective on, how on earth do you actually drive a network moving from what was a static product to this dynamic orchestration, where you've got rules and data-driven orchestrators. What's that doing to the DevOps model for service creation? And how do you manage such a network whenever you've got all these interacting domains?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think Chris's point was really well made. That last question was around radio centric, and I encourage everyone to think probably a lot bigger. I think the value comes across in 5G and in fact any network where how we can think across all the assets we've got, and in fact how 5G as our network connectivity plumbs into the third-party domains. But I think to answer your question, if you unpack what's inside of an orchestrator, I think you need to think once again carefully what's inside of it, and ultimately what you've got now and where you need to take it. And look, at the front end, we talked about intent, but I think the industry needs to work on working out how we interpret that intent and build an intent grammar. That's one element. The second one is, I think, and this is a far more complex one, which I won't do justice to, but I think the second element here is questioning whether perhaps some of the orchestrated technologies that we've got today, which are very workflow-centric, BPM-centric, they're almost like a very linear flow, and you sort of conceive all the scenarios that could occur in branches and trees and so forth. And today they probably integrate to a third element called a policy engine. And I think we sort of need to shift our thinking a little bit more and explore some of the newer emerging technologies, because I'm not sure modeling in a dynamic way workflow will get us there. And there's a lot of technologies, I think, on the horizon that we probably need to look at, perhaps more graph-based models around building topologies and relationships and actions around how we model these services up, and ultimately how we can more dynamically change the policy on those relationships between those nodes. So I think there's a range of technologies in the horizon, George, and I think we need to be exploring them, would be my tip.
Mark, that is just really insightful in terms of that view that there's a range of technologies and we have to really unpack that and even look at the architecture and design of the orchestrator itself. Unfortunately, we're out of time. 30 minutes has gone very, very quickly. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank Mark, Vikrant and Chris for a very interesting insight from their perspective as to what's going on within dynamic orchestration, and hand control back to James. Thank you very much, gentlemen.